Thank you, Brian. It's nice to see you guys again. I'm here to talk about bodily practices and ethnoecological collaboration in the Nature Connection movement. And first, we're going to talk about what is the Nature Connection movement. I was first introduced to this movement here in Athens, Georgia through an organization called Wild Intelligence. And the Nature Connection movement is a loose affiliation of organizations like Wild Intelligence. There's around 400 of them throughout North America, Canada, and Western Europe. And they use exercises to try to help connect people to nature. A lot of them are sensory exercises, so trying to get people to smell the landscape around them and touch it. Like this young man here, Solly, holding a green anole lizard in a Wild Intelligence Kids program. They teach wilderness skills. So like these people here from an adult program at Wild Intelligence have built a small hut out of sticks and leaves, and they slept in it about 3 weeks ago in the freezing cold, and they're pretty proud of themselves for that. And they also try to help people create emotional connections to nature through their programs. I learned about my field site, Sticks and Stones Wilderness School, and it came to my attention that I'm not a geographer because I forgot to make a map of where this place is. So if you can imagine with me, about 2 hours north of Toronto in Ontario on the Georgian Bay, there's a little rural place called Heathcote in the Grey Highlands where Sticks and Stones has its operations. I learned about them just through general contacts with the Nature Connection movement, and they wanted someone to come and research with them. Basically what happened is that 3 years ago, members of a Chippewa band called the Chippewas of Georgina Island, who are about, if I had a map, you would be able to see, about 3 hours to the east of Heathcote, they contacted Sticks and Stones and asked them to run programs for children on the island for the Chippewa youth. And I became really interested in this collaboration. This is a couple of Sticks and Stones mentors setting up for one of those programs. And this is one of the advocates for the programs on Georgina Island, Greer Atkinson, who's been a really great contact. I became really interested in this collaboration because along with natural history, the Chippewas of Georgina Island also wanted to create a cultural revitalization program for youth and for adults. And so along with those desires through the Chippewas, there's also a desire with Nature Connection movements to really change the ways that people interact with their natural environment, and also their own ideas for cultural revitalization. And so through this particular context, I came up with this research question. How do programs for cultural heritage and ecological learning articulate with the goals of educational sovereignty and cultural revitalization within this collaboration? And so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of my theoretical framework that I'm setting up for this, which is what I'd really love some feedback on. First of all, being in anthropology, ethnoecology is a subdiscipline of anthropology, and it's basically the studies of people's understandings of and relationships with nature. Within ethnoecology, there's a long-standing focus on traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which I've defined up here, that body of knowledge, practices, and beliefs pertaining to relationships. TEK is thought to be really important for biocultural conservation. And so one really good example of this is Nancy Turner's work with the Northwest Coast First Nations there. She found that their attitudes about glacial lilies, which is what this plant is here, their observations of ecological assemblages and observations of animal behavior and their general practices led to a really great management regime of this highly used food source. And so research like this has led people to believe that TEK is really important for biocultural conservation. So my research kind of deals with another question. If it's so important for conservation, how do we learn about TEK? So basically, there's been a lot of research here at UGA and at other institutes. So for instance, a graduate of the anthropology department, Rebecca Zarger, did her dissertation work on how children in Belize learn ecological knowledge. And what she found was that through guided instances of learning with parents and with other community members, by having their attention draw to certain aspects of the landscape and of subsistence activities, and through social practice, that kids learned about subsistence practices. And so she really contrasted this a lot with the way that we learn about ecology in Western institutions. So these ideas that people learn through these culturally guided experiences and that TEK preservation is really important has led some researchers to promote ethnoecological education programs. And so this picture and the previous picture came from a program that Rebecca Zarger helped to co-found in Belize called TEACHA. And so I'm following from this literature to explore the processes of developing these ethnoecological and cultural heritage programs which within this First Nations Reserve is a combination of a lot of different traditions and practices. So it's creating a hybrid pedagogy. And I want to really understand participants' goals for doing so, and also the processes of how this occurs in the first place. For this next section, if you know me, you know that I really enjoy video. And part of this interest in video comes from an interest in embodiment theory. And also I have an interest because ethnoecology has a really strong basis in cognition, and I'd like to pull embodiment into this. So I wanted to use embodiment theory to inform ethnoecology and talk about how people use their bodies and their sensory experiences to relate to local environments. And so here's a nifty definition of embodiment theory up here for you, a focus on how the human body, so the senses, the movements, the foci of attention, makes meaning in the world. And Marcel Mauss is someone who I found very inspiring with his essay called Techniques of the Body. He pointed out that some researchers were taking bodily practices for granted, and he gave the examples of how people from different cultures have different methods of swimming. The fact that French and British troops in the 1930s had a really hard time using each other's shovels because there are different bodily practices that go along with those implements. He's also kind of famous for talking about the ways that people organize themselves in military formations. So I'm really interested in the fact that he talks about that the ways that people use their bodies, the way that they perceive their surroundings, even the things that they pay attention to have a cultural basis. So I'm really interested in using video to talk about embodiment, which seems kind of strange. It's hard to talk about embodiment, about these unconscious things that we do every day, like the way I'm even waving my hand around right now. So what Joe Tobin does in his work is he uses video as an elicitation tool to show people what they're doing, to ask them questions about it. So I'd like to use videos to ask how people use their bodies and their sensory experiences to transmit information in these programs that I'm looking at. So for instance, if I were looking at a program like this Wild Intelligence program, it's an adult training program, and this is kind of a version of Marco Polo. So the woman in the blindfold is the bat. She is echolocating by saying bat, and the redheaded gentleman is the moth, and so he's answering back moth, and she's trying to catch him. So this is just one example of hundreds that I can think of the ways that people use their senses and their bodies in learning about ecological knowledge, and I'm trying to transfer that to my own project. These programs don't take place in a political vacuum, and it's necessary to really consider the long-standing struggles for educational educational sovereignty in Canada with First Nations group, and the fact that this collaboration takes place in a context of historical and contemporary inequalities. First Nations educational sovereignty has been a big issue in Canada, I mean, since missionaries arrived, definitely since the advent of residential schools. Since the 1970s, whenever there were assimilation policies that caused the formation of the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now the Assembly of First Nations. So education in this sense is a political act. And critical education theory focuses both on how education can instill common sense assertions for people, as well as encourage resistance to domination. And so critical education theory, in thinking about this particular project, it's an important lens to understand how participants are developing a program that they consider emancipatory in a lot of different ways, and doing so in a context of historical and contemporary inequality. And this is Frary, the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which a lot of you probably know about. I've taken a step more thoroughly into education theory by taking classes in the College of Education and taking what I learned from transformative education theory. This theory was developed by Jack Mesereau to help educators and adult learners learn to critically and reflexively negotiate meanings and values so they don't just take information they're given at face value. And it's also connected to critical education and to emancipatory education and pedagogy of the oppressed. So Mesereau developed this set of stages in which perspectival transformation takes place, and they're very highly contested, they're highly studied. This is the most studied education theory in education. But what I'm really interested in at this point is how this kind of education research is headed now, which is understanding how individual experiences can contribute to social transformation and vice versa, and how various aspects of human experiences, such as emotions and bodily movements and all those aspects that I mentioned before, like the senses, are implicated in individual and social transformations. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that the nature connection movement causes transformation in people. That's not something that I would be able to say at all. So there's not that expectation for my research. However, there's a really strong narrative of transformation within the nature connection movement within this particular program. So what I'm really interested in is understanding what aspects of these programs people think of as being transformative and how do their experiences contribute to that. So that larger context, this theoretical framework has led to these particular sub-questions that I'll tell you about. First of all, what are participants' goals in terms of these human-environment relationships and cultural revitalization? How do they use embodied interactions to kind of transmit these kinds of goals and information? How do those processes of collaborating articulate with historical and contemporary inequalities and the fact that Chippewas are taking over a program from Sticks and Stones mentors who are all white and don't have a lot of information about cultural heritage? And also, what aspects of the collaboration do they consider to be transformative? And these are my methods down here. What I really wanted some feedback on, just besides everything, is that I've been thinking a lot about what is it about my project that reflects my participation in ICON? It's a question I think that we all ask. And so I've structured this in terms of some of the key components of the integrative framework. And so this is how I think it contributes to it. Number one, a focus on a collaboration that's intent on biocultural conservation. And I find really fascinating the Nature Connection Movement's methods for constructing these programs and also the metrics about what local environments and what areas of culture is it they consider to be worthy of conserving. Also, the inclusion of education theory, so I guess like transcending those different disciplinary boundaries. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of trade-offs. So not everyone's ideas are going to make it into this collaboration. You can already see that from the preliminary research. And so I'm kind of wondering, within that context of power, who is it that gets to make these decisions about what content is included in the programs? As far as values and valuation, thinking about understanding the cultural values that are driving the collaboration, process and governance to focus on the processes through which various participants make choices about educational content and practices. Power and inequality, again, focusing on whose voices get heard and who gets to determine the educational content. And strategic communication is the one that I think about the most. As you know, I'm using a lot of video methods, and hopefully with the help of participants, I'll be able to create some sort of video ethnography to help people understand this research more in the program that's happening. There's also a big push within the Chippewa group to kind of document their cultural practices, document a lot of things. And so even just doing things like helping them out with video editing software is something they'd really like me to do. They've made it very clear that I have to present this to the York Regional District School Board, where their kids go to school after elementary school, because they really want their kids to have nature connection and cultural heritage programs throughout the educational processes to try to deal with these larger racist issues that happen after kids leave the mainland, and most likely before. Other Chippewa bands are really interested in this kind of education. They're just waiting for someone to do research before they take the step to invest in it. And so I think my project has a lot of really practical applications as well. And so I'm opening it up to questions and comments if we have any time. And thank you so much.
Has the Chippewa been affected by depeasantization at all?
Depeasantization? That's a really good question. I guess depeasantization isn't something that I'm necessarily so familiar with.
Well, like in a region that I'm interested in, the Caribbean, there are a lot of the younger generation are not interested in becoming farmers or peasants any longer. They're looking more towards technology and just more advancing in that particular way. So the traditional knowledge and livelihood is being threatened in that way. So I just wondered if this stuff was something that kind of like transferred to other indigenous groups or what have you.
I guess I find that really interesting because the Ojibwa or Chippewa in this area would have been hunter-gatherers. So looking back at their history, like I guess depeasantization took place during missionary times, so like within the past 500 years. There were farming as well, like after sedentization, farming occurred, and there were a lot of efforts to try to contain them on reserves so that they could do farming practices. So I guess in that consideration, yes, it's really hard to make a living in that area. There's a lot of financial support from the government and from different reparation programs, but I would say there's a little bit of a renaissance occurring, but in a different way, where people are really interested in forestry and natural resources and conservation on the island and those kinds of careers. So it's kind of a mishmash of, I guess, a lot of different things that have happened in terms of encouraging them to have different different types of livelihoods, and then the opportunities for those being taken away or supplemented by other income. So it's really complex. So